What if two of the most influential figures in human history were searching for the same truth, but from opposite directions? One was a carpenter from an occupied province, surrounded by fishermen, outcasts, and the poor. He never commanded an army, never ruled a nation, and never wrote a single book. The other was the most powerful man on earth, an emperor who ruled over legions, laws, and empires, writing private reflections while the fate of millions rested on his decisions. Jesus Christ. Marcus Aurelius. One spoke the language of faith, the other lived by reason, yet both asked the same haunting question: how does a human being remain unbreakable in a brutal world? This video is not about theology. It is not about belief versus disbelief. And it is not an attempt to place a religious figure inside a philosophical box. This is an investigation into virtue. Today, we place the life and teachings of Jesus Christ inside the courtroom of Stoic philosophy. Not to judge his divinity, but to examine his discipline. Not to debate miracles, but to analyze mastery of the inner world. Because when you strip away rituals, doctrines, and centuries of interpretation, something unsettling emerges. Many of the principles that Stoics spent lifetimes trying to master were lived instinctively and relentlessly by Jesus himself. Control over what truly matters, acceptance of fate without collapse, radical forgiveness in the face of cruelty, an inner kingdom untouched by chaos. But there is also tension, real tension, moments where emotion breaks through, where faith replaces reason, where humility clashes with the Stoic ideal of inner sovereignty. So the real question is not whether Jesus was a Stoic. The real question is far more dangerous. Did Jesus embody the Stoic ideal better than the Stoics themselves, or did he transcend it entirely? Welcome to the Stoic Lighthouse. Let the Stoic Lighthouse guide you toward peace and wisdom. If you are searching for clarity in a noisy world, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. This helps this philosophy reach those who need it most. What follows is not a sermon. It is a philosophical trial. 7 core examinations, 7 moments where faith and reason collide, and one final verdict that may challenge how you see both Stoicism and Christianity forever. Number 1, the inner kingdom, control, freedom, and the Stoic stronghold. In a world obsessed with power, status, and control, Jesus made a statement that quietly dismantled every political fantasy of his time. Standing before Pontius Pilate, the embodiment of Roman authority, military dominance, and imperial law, Jesus was given the chance to defend himself in the language of power, to negotiate, to resist, to play the game that rulers had always played. Instead, he uttered a sentence that shocked the logic of empire. "My kingdom is not of this world." This was not a retreat. It was a philosophical declaration of independence. With those words, Jesus drew a clear boundary between two realms: the external world of force, titles, violence, and domination, and the internal world of judgment, intention, and moral choice. One could be conquered, the other could not. This distinction sits at the very foundation of Stoic philosophy. According to Epictetus, human suffering begins the moment we confuse what belongs to us with what never did. Epictetus taught, "In our power are opinion, aim, desire, aversion, and in a word, whatever is our own doing. Not in our power are the body, property, reputation, offices, and whatever is not our own doing." Jesus' declaration to Pilate mirrors this principle with surgical precision. Rome could command bodies, it could threaten pain, it could take life itself, but it had no jurisdiction over his inner kingdom. His values, his judgments, his alignment with what he believed to be right remained untouched. This idea of an untouchable inner domain later became central to Stoic thought and deeply personal for Marcus Aurelius, who ruled an empire yet constantly reminded himself that true sovereignty begins within. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." For the American audience, this idea resonates deeply because it challenges one of the most deeply ingrained cultural assumptions, the belief that freedom comes from external independence, money, influence, recognition, control over circumstances. Stoicism and Jesus both point to a far more uncomfortable truth. Freedom is internal. Jesus repeatedly refused offers of external power. He walked away from political movements that wanted to crown him king. He rejected wealth, prestige, and protection. Even when faced with execution, he did not attempt to reclaim control over outcomes. His concern remained fixed on integrity of action, not survival of the body. This is not passivity, it is radical self-mastery. Modern Stoic thinkers have emphasized how revolutionary this mindset remains today. In a culture driven by outrage, comparison, and endless craving for validation, the refusal to anchor identity in externals becomes an act of rebellion. According to William B. Irvine, much of modern anxiety stems from chasing what was never under our control to begin with. William B. Irvine explains, by focusing attention on what we can control and relinquishing concern for what we cannot, we gain a remarkable degree of tranquility. Jesus lived this principle fully. While those around him demanded liberation from Rome, he spoke of liberation from fear, hatred, and attachment. While others sought a political revolution, he offered a psychological one. The inner kingdom was not an escape from reality. It was a refusal to be enslaved by it. This idea also traces back to the earliest foundations of Stoicism. Zeno, the founder of the Stoic school, argued that a good life depends not on circumstance, but on alignment with reason and virtue. Zeno taught, happiness is a good flow of life. That flow was not external success. It was harmony between judgment, action, and nature. Jesus' life reflects this harmony in action. He accepted hunger, rejection, humiliation, and death without surrendering his ethical center. Nothing external could force him to betray his inner law. This is the Stoic stronghold in its purest form. Not walls, not weapons, not power over others, but unbreakable command over oneself. And this is the first and strongest point of convergence between Jesus and Stoic philosophy. A shared understanding that the ultimate battlefield is internal, and that whoever governs that inner kingdom is already free, no matter the chains placed on the body. Number 2, Gethsemane, when acceptance becomes absolute strength. There is a moment in the story of Jesus that strips away every romantic image of effortless divinity. A moment where fear, dread, and human vulnerability surface with brutal clarity. It happens at night, in silence, in a garden called Gethsemane. Jesus knows what is coming: betrayal, public humiliation, torture, death. There is no uncertainty left. The future is no longer abstract. It is immediate and unavoidable. And for the first time, we see him hesitate. He withdraws from the others. He kneels, and he speaks words that reveal the deepest tension between human instinct and philosophical mastery. Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. In this single moment contains one of the most profound expressions of Stoic wisdom ever lived. Stoicism does not demand emotional numbness. It does not require a human being to desire pain or pretend that suffering is pleasant. Stoics recognize something called preferred indifference. Health is preferred to illness, life is preferred to death, safety is preferred to harm. The desire for the cup to pass is not weakness, it is honesty. What transforms this moment into philosophical mastery is what follows: the surrender of personal desire to necessity. According to Stoic philosophy, the highest form of strength is not resistance to reality, but alignment with it. This principle later became known as amor fati, the love of fate. Not tolerance of fate, not resignation, but active acceptance. Seneca, who himself faced a forced death sentence, understood this distinction deeply. Seneca taught, "A good person does not complain about fate. He accepts it and follows it willingly." In Gethsemane, Jesus is not crushed by destiny. He does not beg for escape at any cost. He does not rebel against what must happen. He brings his will into alignment with something greater than himself. This mirrors the Stoic idea of the logos, the rational order of the universe, the unfolding pattern of events beyond individual preference. Long before Stoicism, Heraclitus argued that reality flows according to a hidden order, whether humans accept it or not. The wise person does not fight the current, he learns how to move with it. For modern audiences, this moment resonates powerfully because it confronts one of the most difficult truths of life. There are situations that cannot be fixed, negotiated, or escaped. Illness, loss, aging, death, irreversible consequences. The question is never whether pain will appear. The question is whether it will break us internally. Modern Stoic thinkers emphasize that suffering intensifies when we resist what cannot be changed. Psychological pain multiplies when the mind says, "This should not be happening." According to William B. Irvine, acceptance is not passivity, it is clarity. William B. Irvine explains, "When we stop wishing reality were different, we free enormous mental energy to respond wisely to what actually is." Jesus' prayer in the garden is not a request for rescue. It is a declaration of readiness, a moment where fear is acknowledged but not obeyed. He does not say, "I understand this fully." He says, "I accept this fully." This distinction matters. Stoicism teaches that the wise person does not wait for understanding before acting with virtue. He acts in accordance with reason, even when emotions scream otherwise. Epictetus repeatedly reminded his students that events themselves do not disturb us. It is our judgment about them that does. Epictetus taught, "Do not seek for events to happen as you wish, but wish for events to happen as they do happen, and your life will go smoothly." In Gethsemane, Jesus embodies this principle with terrifying clarity. He does not deny fear, he transcends it. He does not escape suffering, he chooses how to meet it. This is where acceptance becomes strength, not the absence of pain, not emotional suppression, but the refusal to let pain dictate character. In that garden, before a single nail is driven, the outcome is already decided internally. The body may suffer, the soul will not collapse. This moment reveals a truth both Stoicism and the teachings of Jesus converge upon. Peace is not found when circumstances become favorable. Peace is found when resistance to reality ends, and that surrender is not weakness. It is the highest form of inner power a human being can achieve. Number 3, love your enemies. The radical logic of universal brotherhood. Among all the teachings attributed to Jesus, none sounds more unrealistic to the modern mind than this one. Love your enemies. In a world built on retaliation, competition, and moral tribalism, this command feels almost offensive, weak, naive, impossible. Yet beneath its moral language lies a cold, rational insight into human behavior, one that Stoic philosophers had already identified centuries earlier. When Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing," he is not offering poetic mercy. He is diagnosing ignorance. This mirrors a core Stoic belief. No one chooses evil knowingly. Harmful actions are the result of flawed judgments, false beliefs about what is good, useful, or necessary. Epictetus expressed this idea without sentimentality. Epictetus taught, "When someone does wrong, immediately say to yourself, 'He acted under the impression that it was right.'" From a Stoic perspective, anger toward an offender is irrational. It assumes malice where there is confusion. It punishes ignorance with hatred, multiplying harm instead of dissolving it. This logic leads directly to the Stoic concept of sympathia, the idea that all human beings participate in the same rational order, bound together whether they realize it or not. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself of this when facing betrayal, corruption, and hostility. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "We were born for cooperation. To act against one another is contrary to nature." Loving an enemy, then, is not emotional affection. It is intellectual clarity. It is the refusal to become morally infected by someone else's ignorance. Jesus pushes this logic to its extreme conclusion. If all wrongdoing is rooted in blindness, then hatred becomes pointless. Revenge becomes self-sabotage. Forgiveness becomes a form of strength. Modern psychology quietly confirms this insight. Chronic resentment traps the mind in a permanent state of threat. Forgiveness, whether religious or philosophical, frees cognitive and emotional energy. This is not moral idealism. It is self-preservation. By refusing to mirror the cruelty of his enemies, Jesus preserves his inner integrity. The body is attacked. The soul remains sovereign. Here, Stoicism and the teachings of Jesus fully converge. The enemy is not the person in front of you. The enemy is the judgment that turns their ignorance into your inner collapse. To forgive is not to excuse, it is to remain free. And in that freedom, both Jesus and the Stoics recognize the highest form of human dignity. Number 4, the temple incident. Emotion, anger, and the Stoic line that was crossed. One episode in the life of Jesus has unsettled philosophers for centuries. He enters the temple, he sees corruption, and he reacts with force. Tables are overturned, merchants are expelled. A whip is raised. This is not quiet resistance, this is anger made visible. For many believers, this moment is explained as righteous anger, a moral eruption justified by injustice. But for Stoic philosophy, this explanation immediately raises a red flag. Stoicism draws a sharp line between action and passion. A wise person may act decisively. He may correct wrongdoing. He may confront injustice. But he must never surrender reason to anger. According to Stoic thought, anger is not strength. It is a temporary madness that clouds judgment and multiplies harm. Seneca devoted an entire work to this subject, warning that anger always damages the one who carries it first. Seneca warned, "Anger, if not restrained, is frequently more harmful to us than the injury that provokes it." From a Stoic perspective, a sage could have corrected the corruption of the temple calmly, firmly, and rationally. The presence of rage suggests a moment where emotion overrides perfect inner control. This is not a moral condemnation, it is a philosophical distinction. The Stoic ideal is apatheia, not emotional emptiness but freedom from destructive passions that hijack reason. Anger, grief, and uncontrolled fear are seen as errors in judgment, not virtues. Jesus is also shown weeping over the death of Lazarus, experiencing deep sorrow in Gethsemane. These moments highlight a key divergence. Stoicism seeks emotional mastery through rational clarity. Jesus allows emotion to surface fully, sanctifying it through meaning rather than suppressing it through discipline. Modern Stoic thinkers often emphasize this difference. According to Massimo Pigliucci, Stoicism does not reject emotion itself, but it rejects emotional domination. Massimo Pigliucci explains, the Stoic goal is not to be emotionless, but to avoid being controlled by emotions that rest on false judgments. And the temple incident reveals that Jesus does not always operate within this Stoic boundary. His moral outrage is real. His emotion is expressed outwardly. For Stoicism, this marks a departure from the ideal of perfect inner tranquility. This moment does not diminish Jesus' moral authority, but it clarifies something essential. Jesus is not pursuing Stoic detachment. He is pursuing moral expression, and here the paths begin to separate. Number 5. The leap of faith, hope versus the discipline of pure reason. The deepest divide between Stoicism and the teachings of Jesus does not lie in ethics, discipline, or self-control. It lies in the foundation of certainty. Stoicism is built on reason, the belief that the universe is governed by a rational order and that human beings participate in that order through their capacity to think clearly. Virtue, for the Stoic, is the result of understanding reality and aligning action with it. Faith is not required, hope is not central, reason is sufficient. This view was shaped decisively by Chrysippus, the architect of Stoic logic, who believed that any belief not grounded in rational coherence was a threat to wisdom. Chrysippus argued, "Without logic, the soul drifts without direction." Jesus offers a radically different anchor. Again and again, he elevates faith above understanding, trust above explanation, surrender above analysis. He tells his followers that faith alone can move mountains, that belief opens doors reason cannot. From a Stoic perspective, this creates a philosophical tension. Power shifts from the disciplined mind to trust in an external will. Stoicism teaches self-sufficiency. The inner citadel is built with rational judgment. No external force grants virtue. No divine intervention replaces clarity of thought. Seneca captured this independence with precision. Seneca wrote, "Virtue is nothing other than right reason." Jesus, by contrast, roots moral transformation in faith in a personal God. Meaning is not discovered solely through reflection. It is received through trust. This difference becomes even sharper when considering motivation. Stoicism teaches that virtue is its own reward. The act itself is the fulfillment. No future compensation is required. Jesus introduces hope beyond this life, a promised kingdom, eternal meaning beyond present action. William B. Irvine has emphasized how Stoicism deliberately avoids this framework. William B. Irvine explains, "The Stoics believe that attaching virtue to future reward weakens its purity. From the Stoic point of view, hope can become a dependency, a projection into the future that distracts from excellence in the present moment. This does not make faith inferior, it makes it different." Stoicism trains the mind to stand alone. Jesus teaches the soul to lean outward. Both paths produce moral strength, both demand sacrifice, but they draw power from different sources. This is not a minor disagreement. It is a fundamental philosophical fork. Reason builds fortresses from within. Faith opens the self to something beyond it. Here, Stoicism and Christianity no longer mirror each other. They diverge. Number 6. The Sermon on the Mount, Radical Humility or Greatness of the Soul. Few teachings in history have challenged human pride as directly as the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus praises the meek, the poor in spirit, those who serve rather than dominate. He kneels to wash the feet of his followers. He elevates humility not as a tactic, but as a virtue in itself. This ethical posture stands in quiet tension with the Stoic ideal of inner greatness. Stoicism does not celebrate arrogance, but it does affirm dignity. The Stoic sage is humble before nature, yet deeply aware of his own worth. He recognizes the divine spark of reason within himself and refuses to diminish it. This idea was central to Stoic ethics, particularly in Roman Stoicism, where moral strength was inseparable from self-respect. Cicero articulated this concept through the idea of greatness of soul, the capacity to rise above fear, pleasure, and social pressure without shrinking oneself. Cicero wrote, "Greatness of soul despises pleasure, wealth, and fame, and considers pain, poverty, and death of little account." For the Stoic, humility does not mean self-erasure. It means freedom from dependence on external validation while maintaining inner sovereignty. Jesus presents something different. His humility is not neutral, it is radical. He teaches that lowering oneself is the path to elevation. That power is perfected through service. That surrender, not self-assertion, transforms the world. This difference unsettled even ancient critics. Friedrich Nietzsche later argued that Christian morality inverted classical values, praising submission where strength once stood. Nietzsche argued, Christian morality glorifies weakness as virtue. While this critique is controversial, it highlights a genuine philosophical contrast. Stoicism seeks self-mastery through inner elevation. Jesus seeks transformation through self-emptying. The Stoic sage stands like a mountain, unshaken and upright. Jesus stands like a servant, bending without breaking. Both produce resilience, both resist corruption, but they shape the self in different ways. One emphasizes inner kingship, the other emphasizes moral surrender. Here, the divergence is not about virtue, but about posture. How the human being stands in relation to himself, to others, and to the universe. Number 7. Final verdict. A master of virtue from a different mountain. After weighing the evidence, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. Jesus Christ was not a Stoic. He did not teach from the Stoa. He did not build his philosophy on logic alone. He did not seek emotional detachment as an ideal. Yet the paradox remains. Through his actions, he lived many of the virtues Stoic philosophers spent their lives trying to understand, refine, and practice. He mastered the inner world. He accepted fate without collapse. He refused to be ruled by fear, hatred, or external power. He preserved moral clarity under extreme pressure. Stoicism aims to align the human mind with reason. Jesus aimed to align the human soul with divine will. The destination often looked similar. The path did not. Stoic philosophy teaches the individual to become sufficient unto himself, to build an inner citadel that no external force can breach. Jesus teaches surrender, trust, obedience to something greater than the self. One path strengthens the self, the other dissolves it. Yet both produce courage, both produce integrity, both produce lives that resist corruption. Jesus did not climb the Stoic mountain. He climbed a different one. But from the summit, the view of virtue looks strikingly familiar. This exploration leaves us with a deeper truth. Wisdom is not owned by a single tradition. The Stoics spoke the language of reason. Jesus spoke the language of faith. Both spoke the language of virtue. They remind us that inner freedom is possible even in a brutal world, that dignity does not depend on power, that moral strength is forged internally long before it is tested externally. Now we want to hear from you. Which of Jesus' virtues most closely aligns with Stoic philosophy in your view? And where do you see the clearest break between faith and reason? Share your perspective in the comments. Thoughtful dialogue elevates everyone who participates. If this video challenged your thinking or offered a new lens on Stoicism and Christianity, support the channel by liking the video. Share it with someone who appreciates deep ideas and honest philosophical dialogue. And if you want more content that cuts through noise and explores timeless wisdom for modern life, subscribe to the Stoic Lighthouse and turn on notifications. In the next video, we will explore a figure who lived at the edge of power, discipline, and inner collapse. A life that forces us to confront the cost of ambition, the danger of ego, and the moment where strength turns into self-destruction. What happens when discipline is pushed too far and the inner compass breaks? Until then, remember this: whether guided by faith in something higher or trust in reason itself, the goal remains the same: to transform suffering into meaning, fear into courage, and chaos into inner order. The language of virtue is universal. See you in the next video.